The desert whispers her name as pain and pride wrestle in her breath, a broken girl rising with a bow, not for revenge, but for a justice. Her father could never dream of giving. The dawn's light seeped over the Cutter ranch like a hesitant specter, washing the yard in pale gold that felt colder than night. Rosalind Cutter stood in the shadows of the porch, her spine rigid against the wind that stirred the dry grass at her feet. Behind her, the barn's weathered boards creaked as if whispering warnings. The scent of horses, a mix of sweat, hay, and earth, hung heavy in the air, pressing at her ribs like the weight of every disappointed glance. She had ever borne. She folded her arms across her chest, as though embracing herself would somehow steel her for the day ahead. Her father's silhouette emerged in the doorway, black against the morning's glow. Sheriff Jacob Cutter's broad shoulders filled the frame, his hat tilted low enough to cast his sharp eyes in shadow. He took a deliberate step forward, the snap of his spurs echoing through the stillness. His gaze tracked the horizon, then settled on Rosalind with a coolness that matched the bone-deep chill of winter's last thaw. He inhaled once, the brim of his hat dipping as he spoke. "Rosalind." His voice was firm as iron on stone, offering no warmth. "Coyle's men ride out at noon. You'll be with them on your way to San Antonio. Remember who you are." She nodded, throat tight. The words, "remember who you are," felt like a verdict passed in silence, an indictment of everything she lacked. Beneath her dress, her skin prickled with shame as memories surged, the barbs of the town's gossip, the clamor of Coyle's cronies mocking her figure, her father's sigh as if her very existence was a burden. Out here, cruelty was currency. Kindness, a debt one could ill afford. She'd learned early to swallow her thoughts, to keep her body hidden behind folds of cloth and downcast eyes. Sheriff Cutter turned back inside without another glance, leaving her to the coyote's distant howl and the lowing of restless cattle. Rosalind exhaled a breath she didn't know she'd held, the noise rattling in her chest. In that moment, the porch felt too small, the ranch too vast. And she felt smaller still, trapped between the rigid laws of her father's making and a world that prized power above mercy. She stepped off the porch, boots sinking into dusty soil. The morning light revealed tracks, hooves pressed into the soft earth, the path her fate had already chosen. With each step, she wondered if the dust would swallow her whole, consigning her to anonymity like livestock unfit for sale. Still, she walked forward, back straight, shoulders squared against the wind, as though willing her own courage into being. By midday, a cloud of dust on the horizon would announce the arrival of Coyle's wagons, and with them a future she did not choose. But in the quiet between dawn and noon, Rosalind carved a moment of stillness for herself, a space in which she could gather the pieces of a self she was only beginning to understand. The wagons rattled through scrub and sun-baked rock, each jolt of wheel a reminder that Rosalind's fate was not her own. She rode perched atop a battered trunk, its leather straps worn thin, her skirts pinned as tightly as her breath against her ribs. Across the wagon bed lay the embossed invitation from Coyle himself, inked in flourishing script. "To my future wife, may your charms rival your father's reputation." Rosalind pressed her palm to the paper, feeling the ridges of the letters beneath her fingertips, as though if she held them long enough, she could will their meaning away. Her companions, Coyle's men, lounged in the heat like scavengers on carrion. At first light, they had offered her stale biscuits and sour coffee, their eyes lingering on the curve of her calf, the gentle swell of her waist. She kept her gaze low, though every whispered jest found its way to her ears. Tilts of shoulder, quick glances passed between grubby hands. She counted the miles by the cruelty in their voices, each taunt a milepost, each leer a landmark marking her descent. By mid-afternoon, the caravan halted at a lonely roadhouse perched on the dusty edge of a dry creek bed. The porch sagged under its own age, and flies swarmed the barrels outside. Inside, the rafters dripped with heat and the stale odor of old liquor. Rosalind stepped down, every muscle taut with anticipation. Coyle's foreman, a gaunt man named Davis, came forward with a leer that felt like a promise. He offered her a cup of watered whiskey, the liquid clinging to the back of her throat like gravel. She forced a curt nod of thanks, but Davis's grin widened. "You'll need more than that to calm your nerves, sweetheart," he said, voice low and coarse. He reached out, fingers brushing her arm. Rosalind flinched, but could not pull away. The men clustered close, forming a ring of heat and malice. Her pulse thundered beneath her ribcage as his hand slid down her back, tracing the swell of her hips. Shame and fear coiled in her gut, hot and hollow. When she tried to stand, another hand closed around her elbow, pain flaring. Laughter rippled through the group. "Easy now," snarled one, as if she were a wild mustang to be broken. They shoved her toward a dark corner of the bar, pinning her against a plank wall scarred by bullets and years of neglect. The day's haze blurred into a single moment of violence, his fist against her jaw, her head snapping back, stars blossoming behind her eyelids. She tasted blood, coppery and fierce, and stifled a cry. Davis spat on the floor. "Too damaged to keep," he muttered, mocking her. The words struck deeper than the blow. Two hands yanked her toward the back door, where the afternoon light lay cruel and unshielded. They bound her wrists with coarse rope, tight, unforgiving, and dragged her beyond the wagons, past the last clump of sagebrush. She stumbled, legs trembling, until they forced her down at the base of a solitary mesquite tree. Its bark was rough against her back, its shade scant as a broken promise. With one final shove, they left her there, her skirts bunched around her waist, the rope cutting into her skin, the world spinning in a corona of heat and humiliation. As the dust cloud of the wagons dissolved into the horizon, Rosalind lay against the tree, realizing that in this desert of cruelty she had become disposable, just another broken commodity in a man's bargain. And yet, as tears mingled with sweat on her cheeks, something inside her clenched, a spark of defiance, small and fierce, refusing to be extinguished. The sun climbed without mercy, its rays slicing through the scant shade of the mesquite's twisted branches. Rosalind lay sprawled at its base, her wrists chafed raw where the coarse rope bit into her flesh. Every breath felt like a betrayal, hot air rasping through her throat until she tasted dust mixed with blood. Her skirt clung damp against her legs, and she dared not move, lest the rope's friction send a fresh wave of agony through her arms. Above her, a circling vulture wheeled on silent wings, its shadow grazing her cheek like a verdict. Time lost shape beneath the relentless blaze. Hours stretched like a living thing, each minute marked by the scrape of rock against rock and the distant groan of the wagons fading into the haze. Pain sharpened her awareness, the sting where the rope had cut, the ache behind her eyes, the throb in her belly with nothing but sun-warmed emptiness. Her mind drifted between memory and delirium, her mother's gentle lullabies, her father's disapproving sigh, the bright promise of green fields that now seemed as distant as another world. When her lips had grown too parched to form words, she pressed her tongue into the furnace of her mouth, craving moisture she did not possess. The mesquite's shadow shrank with the sky's passage, and she sensed the merciless march of the afternoon sun. She thought of crying out, but her voice, hoarse and brittle, would carry only to the mocking wind. No one would come. Out here, mercy was as rare as water. Yet even in the midst of agony, a stubborn pulse of hope flickered in her chest. She recalled the stories of the land, of survivors carried by strangers, of miracles wrought in silence. What if someone found her? What if the desert's cruelty was only half its truth? Gathering what remained of her strength, she lifted her head enough to glimpse the canyon's rim, where rock walls burned crimson under the sun. Somewhere beyond those heights, life persisted. Her pulse slowed, not with relief but acceptance. If the desert intended to swallow her, she would not surrender without bearing witness. With trembling fingers, she scraped at a patch of soft earth, leaving a shallow mark beneath the tree's trunk. A token of existence, a scream etched in dust. When the pain drove her to the brink of blackout, she curled inward, breathing shallow and steady, and remembered every lesson of endurance she had ever learned: how to cradle fear, how to turn panic into purpose. As the sun dipped toward the west and shadows lengthened across the barren ground, Rosalind dared to dream of rescue. Perhaps a rider with a heart steeled against cruelty, perhaps a whisper of compassion carried on quiet feet. Her body trembled, but within that fragility lay a core of iron will. She would not vanish like a specter. Bound to the earth, she formed a silent vow. If mercy came, she would seize it. If not, she would seize her own fate, even if it meant forging freedom from the fire of her suffering. Before the sun crested the distant rim of sandstone, a hush lay over the canyon that felt like prayer. Rosalind's breath came in ragged whispers, the ache in her wrists radiating through every nerve. She drifted between waking dreams and fever's grip as a figure emerged at the edge of her vision. Bundled in faded buckskin, he moved with a deliberate grace, each step measured as though he listened to the land itself. One eye was hidden beneath a weathered patch. The other, dark and luminous, regarded her with a stillness so absolute it stilled the pain for a moment. Kohana knelt beside her, the mesquite's gnarled roots tangling at his leather boots. He carried a skin of water and a carved wooden bowl, its surface etched with the curves of desert storms. Without a word, he tilted her head and pressed the bowl to her lips. The cool water slipped down her throat like liquid rescue, and tears rose unbidden, not of relief, but of release. He watched as her shoulders eased, the tension of hours unfurling in quiet sobs. He cut the rope with a knife whose blade gleamed pale in the dawn. The hemp strands fell away, leaving crimson tracks across her wrists. Kohana lifted her hand and traced the marks gently with his fingertips, as though reading a story inked in blood and dust. The gesture held no pity, only recognition of suffering, of survival. He folded the rope into his coat, preserving it like a talisman against memory's fading edge. He settled her onto his back in a motion that felt both abrupt and tender, as if her frailty and her worth existed in equal measure. Rosalind braced against the rough hide of his pack, the world shifting beneath her as he rose. His one good eye darted northward, scanning the desert floor. Rabbit tracks curling toward a dry wash, the shallow dent where a pronghorn paused to drink. He followed each imprint with the assurance of a man who spoke the land's language. The journey to his hut was a mosaic of pain and wonder. Rosalind felt every jolt of his gait, every sway of his shoulders, yet beneath the agony lay a quiet warmth, a promise that she was no longer alone. The cliffs overhead dripped with shadows. Wildflowers bowed at their jagged feet. Kohana moved through this living tapestry like a ghost bound to memory, and Rosalind clung to him as though he were her last thread to life. When they arrived, the hut stood framed by cottonwood saplings, smoke curling from its stone chimney like incense. Kohana laid her upon a pallet of grasses, his hands deft as he cleaned her wounds with cooled mud and sage. His humming began then, a low, keening tune that rose and fell like the breath of the earth. Rosalind closed her eyes and let the melody carry her away from pain's edge. into a realm where healing felt possible. Outside, the canyon whispered in tomorrow's light. Inside, a broken girl and a half-blind tracker shared the space between silence and song. And in that fragile dawn, something ancient stirred, the promise that even the most ravaged soul could be born anew in the desert's embrace. The interior of Kohana's hut smelled of pine smoke and earth, a fragrance at once harsh and homecoming. Rosalind lay on a low pallet of grasses and hides, her body cocooned in ragged blankets that seemed spun from twilight. Through a chink in the logs, dawn's pale light sifted in, illuminating motes of dust that danced like restless spirits. Kohana moved about with quiet precision, mixing a poultice of clay and crushed yucca root in a wooden bowl. Each scoop held the weight of ritual, the promise that flesh could knit itself whole again. He approached her where she lay, bruises blooming across her skin like dark flowers. Without a word, he pressed a cool smear of paste into the gash along her temple, then wrapped her head in a strip of linen. The sting of cleaning was sharp, but beneath it lay a steadiness she'd never known, an assurance that wounds were not sin, only testament. He knelt and bound her wrists again, this time loosely, with strips of tanned hide softened by oil. The pain receded into memory's margins, leaving behind a quiet ache and gratitude too vast for words. Rosalind's eyes trailed the patterns etched into the hut's walls. Feathers pinned in careful rows, bundles of dried herbs dangling from overhead beams, bleached animal skulls arrayed upon a shelf. Each object spoke of endings and beginnings, death giving shape to life, loss transformed into understanding. Beside the door, a rack of hunting bows leaned against the logs, their sinew taut and sure. She traced one with her gaze, imagining the curl of her fingers around its grip, the flight of an arrow loosed in justice. Kohana sat opposite her and poured a small cup of tea brewed from willow bark. He held it out, and Rosalind drank, savoring the bitter warmth that settled like armor in her belly. When she set the cup back on the wooden slab, her voice came in a dry whisper. "Why help me?" The words were fragile as butterfly wings. He regarded her a long moment, then touched the bandage at his covered eye. "Once," he said, voice low as canyon wind, "I too was left for dead." His story unfurled in the hush. A warrior exiled after his clan's massacre, abandoned by those he swore to protect. The skulls on the shelf were his kin, each one a reminder that the land bore witness to every wrong. "Mercy," he said, "is the echo we send back into the world. I heard yours." In the days that followed, Rosalind learned the hut's rhythms. Mornings brought hunts for jackrabbit and quail. Afternoons, lessons in tracking footprints etched in dusty soil. Her limbs trembled as she flung the bowstring, each missed target a testament to her inexperience. Yet Kohana's praise, quiet and precise, found her trembling pride and coaxed it outward. At night they sat by the fire, and he taught her the names of stars that rolled above the canyon, constellations mapping a path between past and future. Within those warped logs, Rosalind's fear unraveled. She felt the ghost of her father's contempt recede, replaced by something fiercer. Purpose. In the flicker of firelight, she met Kohana's one sharp eye, and between them bloomed a pact, not of blood, but of shared survival. Here, amidst bones and shadows, a broken girl was learning to become whole again. Dawn's chill clung to the canyon walls as Rosalind rose from her pallet, joints stiff from hours of rest. Outside, the world lay hushed, the air alive with the soft susurrus of cottonwood leaves. Kohana stood waiting, bow slung low across his back, one eye closed against the pale light. He nodded to the slope leading down into the wash, and without a word, stepped forward onto the scattered stones. Rosalind followed, her bare feet pressing into the cool dust. Each footfall felt amplified, her heartbeat drumming in her ears, until she forced herself to slow her pace, matching Kohana's long, measured stride. He paused at a rabbit track, the faint outline of paw and claw etched in powdery earth. He knelt and brushed a fingertip over the print, then looked back at her, lifted an eyebrow as though inviting her to speak. She knelt beside him, tracing the tracks with trembling fingers, and saw how the soil held its shape, how the smallest detail spoke of weight and direction. Onward they moved, deeper into the wash, where sun and shadow tangled like dancers. Kohana pressed a hand to a sandstone slab, listening. Rosalind laid her cheek against the rock beside him, closing her eyes and straining to hear what he heard. The scurry of a lizard fleeing into a crevice, the faint drip of groundwater seeping through unseen cracks, the distant thud of her own heart. Sound bloomed around her, a hidden map guiding each motion. He rose and held out a coil of rope, demonstrating how to step lightly, how to carry one's weight so that the earth remained undisturbed. She imitated him, adjusting each shift of hip and ankle until her footsteps whispered. Her body, once ill at ease in open space, now felt attuned to its contours. The gentle rise of a dune, the hollow beneath a mesquite's roots, the brittle snap of sun-baked twigs underfoot. By midday's heat, they reached a plateau strewn with cactus blossoms that mirrored the sky's pale hue. Kohana knelt again, pressing clay between his palms and forming a delicate mold before imprinting it on a fallen frond. When he turned it over, the shape of a jackrabbit's paw emerged in relief. He set it before Rosalind and spoke her name softly, as though teaching a child to speak. "Tomorrow," he said, "you will find the track we leave." She studied the clay print, memorizing the ridge of each pad, the spacing of toes, feeling in her mind the pattern that would guide her. That night, under a sky frosted with stars, Kohana showed her how to move through silence as one moves through prayer, each breath an offering, each step an act of reverence. Rosalind sat by the dying embers and recalled the hollow ache of the mesquite stump where she'd nearly died. In its place now flickered something gentler, the quiet glow of confidence forged in absence and taught in stillness. By the time the moon rose, Rosalind knew that solitude could be sanctuary, that silence could speak, and that the land, once her prison, had become her greatest teacher. Weeks bled into weeks, each dawn bringing pain sharpened by practice, and each dusk easing into quiet pride. Rosalind rose before the sun, her muscles tight with anticipation rather than dread. Kohana led her each morning to a clearing ringed with juniper and sagebrush, where the air tasted of cold stone and potential. He set carved targets of clay and bone, rabbit skulls cracked in half, woven reeds tied into rough silhouettes, and handed her the bow he himself had fashioned. Its wood was dark and grainy, the sinew taut with promise. Her first draws were clumsy. The string slapped her forearm, the arrow splintered against the clay, rebounding with a sting that reddened her palm. Frustration pinched her chest, the old shame rooting at her resolve. But Kohana was patient, correcting the angle of her elbow, the twist of her wrist, the shift of her stance. He never spoke of failure. Instead, he pointed to each fragment of broken clay as evidence of effort, each bent shaft as the seed of mastery. By the seventh try, the arrow sang from the bow, slicing the air with a sound like wind through canyon walls, and struck dead center in a woven reed. Rosalind froze, breath lodged in her throat. Kohana stood back, his one eye bright as a sunlit pool. He nodded once, and the stillness broke. She exhaled, the tension uncoiling through every bone. For the first time, her reflection in the water skin beside the target didn't mock her form. It showed the straight line of her shoulders, the set of determination in her jaw. Afternoons were for tracking live prey. cottontail rabbits darting through scrub, quail twisting skyward in startled wings. Kohana stalked beside her, voice a soft undercurrent of instruction. "Be the wind," he said, "not the stone." Rosalind crouched low, chest pressing the ground's heat, eyes locked on a rabbit nibbling near a wash. When she loosed the arrow, it flew with silent purpose and struck true. The creature collapsed almost immediately, its final thump a jarring punctuation against the canyon's quiet. That night, they skinned and dressed the rabbit by firelight. Rosalind's hands trembled as she worked, but Kohana guided her without condescension, showing how to remove sinew, how to flavor meat with smoke and juniper berries. When they ate, the sweetness of the flesh tasted of victory and survival. She felt her body shift beneath her stitches of fatigue and triumph, skin hardening into armor not of metal, but of living sinew and will. In moments between lessons, Rosalind examined the scars along her wrists. The flesh had begun to smooth, the reddened lines paling into pink ribbons of memory. She raised her hand to the moonlight slipping through the hut's chinks and noted how steady her fingers were now, how the pulse of her veins throbbed with a calm power rather than fear. As the full moon rose, Kohana and Rosalind stood atop a ledge overlooking the canyon floor. He laid a hand on her shoulder, their silent bond affirmed by touch, and sent her gaze outward. Below, the desert stretched, austere yet alive, waiting for those brave enough to claim it. Rosalind inhaled the night air, carrying within it the scent of juniper and promise. In that moment, she understood. She had been forged here by knife and song, by bone and breath, and she would never again be content to merely survive. She would thrive. Back in Cutter's town, the midday sun ignited dust motes and amber shafts through saloon windows and painted the boardwalks in molten light. But beneath the heat lay a restless hum, an electric current of rumor that pulsed through the streets. At Widow Hart's Mercantile, the clerk paused in his ledger, glancing toward the door as if expecting a phantom. At the livery, a stable hand whispered to a groom as they brushed a sorrel's flank. Even at the jailhouse, where Sheriff Cutter held court over drunks and debtors, the sudden hush of his deputies betrayed unease. They said the sheriff's daughter had vanished, spirited away by bandits, some claimed, or spirited away by madness, others insisted. The rumor spread like wildfire through the town's tinderbox gossip. She'd been seen riding a pinto at dawn, her skirts torn, her hair wild with dust and defiance. The children dared one another to press their faces against the hitch rail and watch for her ghost beneath the mesquite. The women in calico dresses crossed themselves when the name Rosalind floated past, voices trembling with pity or fear. They could not decide which. Sheriff Cutter felt it most keenly in the courthouse. He sat behind his polished desk, its surface scarred by years of ink and blood, and peered at the empty chair opposite. Every time a deputy mentioned a missing wagon train or a lone traveler found dead, Cutter's gaze flicked to the doorway, waiting for his daughter to stride in. When she did not come, he drilled the men with questions. Any sign of blood? Footprints? Tracks? They answered each time with the same hollow shake of their heads, his jaw clenched until his cane's silver pommel bit into his palm. At the saloon that evening, Davis, Coyle's foreman, leaned over the bar, glass in hand, voice low enough that only the barkeep heard. "Heard she's alive," he muttered, eyes darting around. "Riding with—" He swallowed hard and spat. "A native tracker. Some call him Two Eyes Shut." The barkeep stiffened, hands pausing on the freshly swept floor. Word of Kohana's name was like a curse. Many in town recalled tales of Apache raids, and the thought of alliance with a settler's daughter made them shift in discomfort. By moonrise, a hush had settled over the boardwalks. Lanterns glowed behind shuttered windows as the town held its breath. Sheriff Cutter stepped onto his porch, surveying the silent street with a father's dread and a lawman's resolve. He lifted his gaze to the canyon rim. Darkness pooled in its crevices, and wondered if she stood there now, watching him with eyes he would not recognize. And somewhere beyond those shadows, Rosalind and Kohana listened. Her heart thrummed at the sound of her father's name on the wind, part accusation, part plea. Yet she remained silent, letting the desert's roar fill the space where doubt once lived. The town could whisper its fears and spread its lies, but in the hush between two hearts, truth lay waiting to be spoken. At dawn's first silver light, the air above Cutter's town was still, as if the world itself waited for a reckoning. Then, on the ridge overlooking Main Street, a lone rider appeared against the pale sky. Rosalind Cutter sat tall in her saddle, her silhouette slender and unwavering. Her clothes, once soft cotton, were now dyed by dust and smoke, stiff and darkened like leather, and the bow across her back gleamed at her hip. Her hair was braided tight to her head, each twist a testament to months spent beneath canyon suns and moon shadows. In the street below, a cluster of townsfolk gathered at the hitch rails, their conversations halting mid-word as eyes turned skyward. Sheriff Jacob Cutter emerged from the courthouse doorway, cane in hand and heart hammering against his ribs. He squinted at the figure above, hardly daring to believe the rumor come true. The rider set her mount into motion, the horse's hooves striking spurts of dust that drifted like ghosts across the boardwalk. Rosalind guided the horse down the winding trail that led over the mesa's edge. With each step, the ground seemed to breathe beneath her, as though reclaiming her presence after long absence. The wind caught the hem of her skirt and lifted it in a slow, defiant wave. She rode without haste, yet every movement was deliberate, her shoulders squared, her gaze fixed on the narrow street where her father waited. When her horse's hoof struck the last plank of weathered wood, the world snapped taut like a bowstring. Townsfolk stepped aside in silence, their faces etched with disbelief. The children froze mid-laugh. Gamblers let cards slip from their fingers. Even the drunks at Pigot's saloon blinked soberly, as if in the presence of a spirit returned. Rosalind dismounted, boots clicking against the wood in a staccato that echoed through the hush. She unhooked her bow and slid it into the loop at her waist, fingertips brushing the fletching of an arrow sheathed there. Her eyes, once downcast and uncertain, now held a fierce light, a quiet fire that did not waver. Sheriff Cutter stepped forward, his gait rigid with shock and relief. The memory of the frail girl he'd sent away warred with the woman before him. He met her gaze, searching for the child he thought he'd lost. Instead, he found someone forged by hardship and hope, someone who wore survival like armor. He opened his mouth, but no words came. Rosalind held his stare, the distance of years and miles compressed into a single breath. Behind her, the morning sun gilded the cannon-battered saloon signs and the plank-jointed storefronts, yet all she saw was her father's face, lined with helplessness, etched with regret. She inclined her head once, a gesture of acknowledgment and warning. Without another word, she turned and strode toward the courthouse steps, her boots striking a rhythm that told of purpose born from suffering. The hush broke then in 1,000 silent gasps, and the town exhaled. Another chapter had begun, and nothing would ever be the same. Rosalind paused at the foot of the courthouse steps, bow in hand and heart steady. The morning light glinted off the polished wood of the railings, but her gaze was fixed on the men arrayed before her, Coyle's foreman Davis clutching his hat, the hired hands shifting uneasily, and Sheriff Cutter standing aside, cane forgotten in his grip. She lifted her chin, and as her voice rang out across the square, it carried the weight of every moment she'd survived. "You know why I'm here," she said, each word measured. "You left me for dead beneath a mesquite. You thought I'd vanish like a worthless hide." Her eyes flicked to Davis. "Davis, you called me too damaged to keep. Speak now, if you have the courage." He swallowed, face pale, but his jaw clenched. The crowd leaned forward, silent as foxes stalking prey. I don't remember," he stammered, voice small against the breeze. A ripple of disbelief ran through the onlookers. Rosalind's hand tightened on the bowstring. "Then recall this." She notched an arrow, drew the string back until the sinew whispered. Davis's eyes traveled the flight path as though the arrow pierced his soul before its fletching cut air. With calm precision, Rosalind released. The arrow struck the mesquite's trunk at Davis's feet, quivering in the pale bark. The thud was a verdict nobody could dispute. Gasps broke the hush, and Davis stumbled back, face slack with shock. Behind him, other men reached for guns, but she held up a gloved hand. "No more violence today," she said. "Tell the truth, or face exile into the desert as empty as those wagons left me." At her back a distant cry rose, the war whoop of Apache riders descending from the rim. A dozen warriors swept down the dusty alley, faces painted with ochre and charcoal, rifles slung over sun-browned shoulders. Kohana rode at their head, one eye gleaming beneath the brim of his hat. The sight froze the town in its tracks. Horses snorted, spooked by the thunder of hoofbeats. Even Sheriff Cutter found his voice. "Rosalind," he began, relief and horror tangled in his tone. "This isn't justice." She turned to him, sorrow and steel in her gaze. "Justice was never yours to give," she replied softly. Then to the crowd she laid bare the cattleman's crimes, the stolen water rights, the illegally branded calves, the hired guns who'd beaten her and blamed her for their brutalities. As she spoke, the Apache warriors formed a silent guard, rifles trained skyward in warning. Each name she uttered cracked the veneer of the frontier's civility, exposing the rot beneath. Coyle's men dropped their heads, deputies averted their eyes, and the townspeople murmured among themselves, shame weaving through their whispers. When Rosalind finished, Kohana stepped forward, dislodged the arrow from the mesquite, and handed it to her. "Mercy is earned," he said in his deep, hushed voice. "You have given them both warning and chance." Rosalind sank the arrow into the dusty earth and raised her hand in blessing rather than threat. The Apache warriors stepped aside, vanishing as swiftly as they'd appeared. Sheriff Cutter slowly approached his daughter, shame softening the lines of his face. He offered her his hand again, and this time she took it not in submission, but in solidarity. Together they stood beneath the mesquite, father and daughter bound by truth, the land, and a reckoning that would shape them both. The morning after the reckoning, Cutter's town stirred like a wounded animal waking to strange quiet. Doors creaked open on unsteady hinges, and the scent of charred sage drifted through empty streets. Rosalind stood alone at dawn's first breath, the mesquite silhouette etched against pale sky. She inhaled the cool air heavy with possibility, and turned to find her father at her side, his hat removed, his posture humble yet resolved. Together they walked through the square, footprints trailing behind them like vows. At the outskirts, the exiled cattleman's wagon lay abandoned, water skins dry, branding iron cold. He had vanished into the desert, a ghost born on wind and shame. The townsfolk emerged from behind shutters, women clutching shawls, men leaning on posts, and met Rosalind's gaze without fear. In their eyes flickered respect, tempered by regret. She offered a nod, brief as a falling star, and they lowered their heads in quiet atonement. Sheriff Cutter led his daughter to the courthouse steps. He set aside his cane and lifted a ledger, its pages blanking the sins now unspoken. With steady hand, she inscribed new laws: no more hired guns, no more stolen water, no more silencing the weak. Each stroke of ink was a promise. That cruelty would no longer be the town's currency. He watched her write, his throat tight, as the weight of his own past judgment settled like dust upon him. When she closed the ledger, her eyes found his, and she saw forgiveness not as surrender, but as the beginning of understanding. Behind them, Kohana appeared on the ridge, his horse stepping lightly across rock. He rode forward, the Apache warriors dispersed like morning mist. His one good eye rested on Rosalind with pride unspoken. She beckoned him down the slope, and he dismounted, weathered hands offering the carved bow he had given her long ago. She accepted it, feeling the smooth curve against her palm, the sinew's taut strength resonating with her own. Their hands brushed, the contact a bridge between worlds once divided by fear and memory. As sun climbed, father, daughter, and the silent tracker gathered beneath the mesquite tree, the same that had watched her agony and her triumph. Rosalind knelt and pressed her palm to its bark, a sign of respect for a guardian that bore witness to her rebirth. Sheriff Cutter stood behind her, his shadow enveloping both tree and daughter in a silent vow that this land would cultivate mercy as fiercely as it shaped steel. When the wind whispered through the branches, it carried a chorus of new beginnings. Horses neighed in distant corrals, roosters crowed, the cattle stirred, lowing in contented chorus. The town, once gasping beneath the weight of its own silence, breathed out relief. Rosalind rose and turned her face toward the horizon where canyon walls flamed gold. Her journey had begun with abandonment and pain, but it would continue with purpose and hope. In the hush of dawn, the desert exhaled alongside her. A land once indifferent now bound to her story, its scars healing in tandem with her own. And as she took her father's arm and walked toward a new day, the mesquite stood witness to a hard-won peace, one forged in sorrow, sealed by justice, and carried forward on the wings of survival.